America loves a good feud. Political battles, celebrity scandals, sports rivalries, they all get airtime. But nothing, absolutely nothing, hits harder than a suburban fight between a homeowner and an HOA president who thinks she's the deputy mayor of the neighborhood. Today's headline dives straight into that uniquely American battleground where beige siding is law, yard gnomes stare into your soul, and one misplaced trash bin can get you fined into oblivion. This is the story of how one man, armed with a tape measure, a 2-foot vinyl fence, and a hedge that might as well be a botanical skyscraper, turned Maplewood Estates into the front line of polite suburban rebellion. And yes, it's every bit as dramatic, outrageous, and hilariously American as you're imagining. Let's break down the top 10 ways this average guy legally outplayed his HOA, outsmarted Brenda from Unit 4B, and built the most iconic hedge east of the Mississippi. It always starts simple, right? A cup of coffee, a peaceful morning, maybe a light breeze whispering through the trees, until your HOA president shows up with a clipboard and a smile that says she's been waiting all week to ruin your life. That's exactly how this saga kicks off. In the heart of Maplewood Estates, with our guy just trying to enjoy a moment of peace on his own property. Seems reasonable enough, but this is America, where homeowners associations roam free and unchecked like over-caffeinated home monitors. Our protagonist, let's call him John, had a problem most suburban folks know way too well: privacy, or the absolute lack of it. His backyard was basically the neighborhood's open-air theater. Kids screaming at the pool, neighbors strolling by, Brenda's trio of eternally disappointed garden gnomes staring into his windows like judgmental little lawn security cameras. Picture waking up every morning, stretching, looking out your kitchen window, and immediately locking eyes with a resin garden figure silently communicating you're doing life wrong. Yeah, not ideal. So John did what any red-blooded American homeowner with a weekend, a YouTube tutorial, and a Home Depot credit card would do. He built himself a solid, beautiful, handcrafted 6-foot cedar privacy fence. The thing was gorgeous. Straight lines, clean stain, strong posts. This fence could survive a tornado. It was functional, it was aesthetic, it blocked out the noise, the chaos, and most importantly, Brenda's omnipresent gaze. And for a moment, life was good. Birds chirping, no toddlers screaming, no gnomes silently judging. A suburban utopia. But like every good suburban story, utopia is brief. Because Brenda, the HOA president, the self-appointed guardian of Maplewood's aesthetic integrity, and the human embodiment of a rulebook, saw the fence and immediately descended upon John like she was auditioning for a procedural drama called Law & Order HOA Unit. She hit him with the first violation notice before the stain on the fence had even dried. This wasn't a simple, "Hey neighbor" situation. This was a thick envelope with official typography, probably printed on the kind of cardstock only people who take community bylaws too seriously ever purchase. She marched over to his property line with the confidence of someone who believes her lawn flamingos are tasteful and her authority unquestionable. This first notice, it was just the beginning, because if there's one thing Brenda loves more than HOA power, it's escalation. John's fence became her personal Everest. Every time she looked at it, she saw a challenge to her suburban throne. She issued not one, not two, but 4 consecutive violation notices, each more dramatic than the last. It got to the point where John started expecting to find a new notice tucked into his door every time he grabbed the mail, alongside coupons and pizza flyers. And the kicker? Brenda wasn't acting alone. Oh no. She had the full HOA machinery on her side. Secret committees, measured tape, obscure legal terms, the whole suburban bureaucracy. It was like if the DMV and a middle school student council had a baby. And well, John was about to decide that if this was the game Brenda wanted to play, then he was going to play it by the rules. All the rules, and maybe bend them, twist them, or use them as weapons of legal genius. And if Brenda thought a couple of sternly worded notices were enough to stop him, she clearly underestimated how creative one man can get when pushed by HOA tyranny. Because fact number 2 is where the ridiculousness hits maximum American absurdity. When the second violation notice dropped, John figured he'd remeasure everything, just to be safe, just to make sure Brenda wasn't hallucinating numbers in her quest to crush his soul. But nope. Turns out she wasn't imagining anything. She was just measuring harder than anyone had ever measured anything. The HOA rulebook, which, by the way, is thicker than some college textbooks, states fences must be no taller than 48 inches, 4 feet, a child height fence, a barrier suitable for keeping a slightly motivated corgi at bay, and nothing else. Meanwhile, John's fence stood proudly at 6 feet and 3 inches. 3 extra inches. 3 inches was the difference between absolute suburban tranquility and an economic death spiral of HOA fines. And because Maplewood Estates operates with the same compassion level as a malfunctioning parking meter, the fine wasn't a one-time slap on the wrist. No. They hit him with $50 per day, every day, until the fence came down. Let that sink in. That's $350 a week. That's the price of gas, groceries, a weekend getaway, or apparently the privilege of being slightly too tall in Brenda's kingdom of Bay's conformity. You'd think 3 inches would be negotiable, that maybe some reasonable conversation could happen, that maybe, just maybe, an adult human being could say, "Hey, that's fine, no big deal." But Brenda isn't reasonable. Brenda is the kind of person who alphabetizes her spices and has strong opinions about mulch composition. So John tried doing things the polite way. He called the HOA office and got Chad. Poor Chad, the intern who probably signed up thinking he'd be doing spreadsheets or answering emails, not mediating armed conflict over fence height. Chad, a beacon of hope with minimal training, told John the city standard was 6 feet. 6, not 4. But here's the thing. Maplewood Estates doesn't follow city standard. They follow Brenda standard. A stricter, more painful, spiritually draining set of rules. And so, despite Chad's best intentions, despite the logic, despite the fact that a 6-foot fence makes more sense than a 4-foot fence in any universe that respects physics or privacy, John was screwed. Financially, emotionally, spiritually, legally, all of the above. He had to cut the fence down. Literally, he had to take a saw and amputate his creation. 2 full feet, sliced away like a heartbreaking suburban tragedy. The fence went from majestic to embarrassingly tiny, a sad little barrier that couldn't block anything except maybe a particularly polite squirrel. But here's the funny part. Even after he chopped it down, the fines didn't disappear immediately. No. Brenda wanted proof. She wanted photos, measurements, confirmation. She wanted documentation like John was applying for a passport, not fixing a fence. John's frustration? It hit legendary levels. That deep American-style frustration that turns a calm person into someone who considers learning zoning law as a hobby. And that feeling, that simmering sense of being technically correct while still losing, well, that lit the spark of something much bigger. Because nothing burns creativity quite like petty injustice. And John was about to discover a loophole so powerful, so beautiful, So devastatingly effective, it would rock Maplewood Estates to its very soul. Because if you think a 3-inch violation was the craziest part, you're not ready for fact number 3, where the man discovers the loophole that would change the entire neighborhood forever. What do you do when the system beats you? You study the system. You learn its weaknesses. You learn its blind spots. You learn its tiny, overlooked details written by lawyers who got paid by the hour and probably never imagined a homeowner would actually read the entire CC&R document from cover to cover. And John read it. He read it like a man possessed, like a man denied privacy one too many times, like a man who paid $350 in fines over 3 inches of wooden excess. And then he found it, the golden goose, the holy grail, the ultimate wait a damn minute clause. Section 4.1a, the landscaping rule. It says homeowners can plant approved living foliage on their property lines. And that's it. No maximum height, no maximum density, no maximum, are you sure this isn't a forest restriction? You could plant a 5-foot shrub, a 10-foot shrub, a 15-foot shrub, as long as it was alive and HOA approved. And guess what made the list? Emerald green arborvitae, nature's privacy wall, the shrub equivalent of a fortress, capable of growing up to 15 feet tall and thick enough to hide a Sasquatch. In a single moment of clarity, John realized what generations of homeowners before him had missed. The HOA was obsessed with man-made structures, but completely careless about plants. To the HOA, fences were dangerous, unsightly, regulated, but plants? They assumed plants behaved. They assumed people planted flowers, not botanical barricades. They assumed landscaping was gentle, decorative, polite. They did not anticipate John. And just like that, the universe gave him the ultimate weapon, a legal, towering wall of green that could block out Brenda, her gnomes, the community pool, and possibly the sun if he planted enough of them. He didn't need a 6-foot fence. He needed a 2-foot compliance fence and a 10-foot hedge of absolute destruction standing right behind it. This was not just a loophole. This was a masterpiece of tactical legal landscaping. And the best part? Brenda wrote these rules. She enforced these rules. She practically worshipped these rules. And these very rules were about to become her downfall. For the first time in 9 months, John felt hope. Not just hope. He felt motivation, vindication, a burning desire to weaponize chlorophyll. He began planning, sketching, measuring sunlight angles like a man ready to out-bureaucrat the queen of bureaucracy herself. He wasn't just building a privacy barrier. He was building a monument to rule-following vengeance. And when he realized the HOA had no jurisdiction over plant height, his smile lit up the room like a man who discovered cheat codes in real life. But a plan is just a plan until you bring in reinforcements. And in fact, number 4, this petty brilliance gets engineering-level strategic. Once John realized he had stumbled onto the HOA equivalent of a constitutional loophole the Founding Fathers would have high-fived him for, everything shifted. What had once been a depressing suburban defeat suddenly became a masterclass in strategic, highly caffeinated, legally airtight revenge. This wasn't just a comeback. This was a cinematic turnaround, the kind of plot twist that deserves dramatic music and a slow zoom-in shot. Picture the scene. John sitting at his dining table, CC&R booklet sprawled out like he's studying for an exam he never signed up for, but suddenly has a burning desire to ace. Sticky notes everywhere, highlighters in every color, coffee mug number 4 sitting off to the side like a loyal soldier. The man wasn't reading bylaws, he was decoding them. He was treating this document like it contained state secrets, or maybe cheat codes for life. And then comes the blueprint moment. The sort of moment where a lesser man would simply accept the fence defeat. But John? Oh, John is built different. He started sketching, drafting, planning, the kind of planning usually reserved for military strategy units or guys trying to assemble IKEA furniture without crying. He drew out measurements, angles, distances, property lines. He mapped the exact position where the 2-foot fence would sit and how close behind it he could plant an entire evergreen army. And the plan was genius, beautifully simple yet devastatingly effective. He would remove the amputated, pathetic 4-foot fence entirely, replace it with a crisp, clean, HOA-approved 24-inch white vinyl fence. The kind of fence so compliant, so painfully perfect, so aggressively unthreatening that even Brenda would run out of vocabulary to complain about it. This fence would be the poster child of HOA obedience, a fence so compliant it practically saluted the bylaws. Then came the real move, the masterstroke. Exactly 12 inches behind that little vinyl fence, he would plant an entire row of emerald green Arborvitae, each of them destined to grow into a towering 10-foot thick, luxurious wall of living privacy. A vertical garden of victory, a chlorophyll-powered middle finger to anyone who ever had an opinion about fence height. This was no ordinary hedge. This was the suburban equivalent of Fort Knox. And the best part? Every single inch of it was legal. Technically, precisely, perfectly legally. Because the bylaws said absolutely nothing, not one measly sentence about how tall approved living foliage could grow. It was a literal green light for John's botanical revenge mission. He could almost imagine the look on Brenda's face when she saw the new setup. A tiny 2-foot model citizen fence in the front, and behind it, a forest wall that could hide Bigfoot and an entire marching band. The image alone fueled him like rocket fuel. But planning the plan wasn't enough. John needed precision. He needed accuracy. He needed the perfect measurements because the last thing he wanted was to be off by a single inch and give Brenda even a sliver of authority to attack him with another laminated violation notice. No, this time the compliance would be so immaculate she'd have no angle, no clause, no loophole of her own. For the first time in months, John felt empowered. Not just empowered, inspired, motivated, alive. He went from defeated homeowner to suburban general preparing for the battle of aesthetics. He was about to out-HOA the HOA with their own rulebook. He measured the yard, checked the soil, calculated root spread, sunlight exposure, irrigation potential. The man was treating his backyard like a botanical engineering site. Anyone looking over the fence, if such a fence existed, would have thought he was planning a rocket launch. The most delicious part of the plan? The moment Brenda saw the 2-foot fence, she'd probably relax, maybe even congratulate herself on bringing him back into compliance. She'd think she'd won. She'd think she'd tamed the rebel of Maplewood Estates. But she wouldn't even be ready for the hedge phase, the towering emerald green tsunami of foliage that would rise behind that fence like nature itself had decided to join John's rebellion. And John wasn't just building privacy, he was building symbolism, a living monument to the idea that if the system tries to box you in, you break out through the shrubbery. But even the greatest revenge plan can't be executed alone. And in fact, the whole operation takes a wild turn when John recruits the most unexpected horticultural hero Maplewood has ever seen. If every great rebellion has a turning point, then every suburban rebellion needs a hero, or at least a contractor with absolutely nothing to lose. And in this story, that hero came in the form of George, a landscaper whose entire aura screamed, "I've seen things. I've planted things. I fear nothing. But before George became the legend of Maplewood Estates, John had to go through a little recruitment phase. And by recruitment, I mean he started calling every fence guy, contractor, and landscaper within a 50-mile radius and getting rejected like he was trying to hire someone for an underground hedge fight club. The first guy he called was fence guy Frank. Now, Frank was old school, the type of man who talked like he had gravel in his throat and built fences like he was prepping for the apocalypse. John explained the plan, the tiny 2-foot fence, the trench, the massive hedge, and Frank's reaction was priceless, pure silence. The kind of silence that says, I'm trying to decide if you're insane or if your HOA is. When Frank finally spoke, he didn't mince words. Kid, he said, I build fences for privacy. A 2-foot fence ain't privacy. A 2-foot fence is a suggestion. John explained to Jen it wasn't about privacy. It was about compliance. It was about the loophole. It was about weaponizing vegetation. But Frank wanted no part of this botanical Cold War. I don't get paid enough to be an accessory to neighborhood drama. Call a landscaper. Click. Rejection. Total rejection. And honestly, it only fueled John's motivation. Because if a grizzled fence veteran was scared, then clearly this hedge operation had legendary potential. Enter Green Thumb George. He found him in a local ad, one of those small listings with a faded phone number, the kind of ad that either leads you to a genius or someone who will accidentally plant bamboo in your yard and destroy your foundation. But when George showed up, any doubts disappeared instantly. George stepped out of his truck wearing cargo shorts, a sun-faded baseball cap, and a 5 o'clock shadow that looked like it had been there since last Tuesday. He smelled faintly of fertilizer, gasoline, and pure determination. The man radiated landscaper energy. He took one look at John's amputated 4-foot fence, squinted at it like an art critic observing a tragic sculpture, and said, All right, what's the job? John explained the plan. The tiny 2-foot vinyl fence, the precise 1-foot gap behind it, the trench, the massive 9 to 10-foot hedges. Legally approved, HOA compliant, and emotionally damaging to Brenda. George didn't blink. He didn't laugh. He didn't hesitate. Instead, he leaned in like John had just told him he discovered buried treasure. You want to plant a wall of giant Arborvitae behind a 2-foot decorative fence to spite your HOA? Not to spite them, to comply, aggressively. A grin spread across George's face, slow, wide, and absolutely chaotic. The grin of a man who has suffered through one too many HOA complaints about grass length irregularities and is ready to watch the world burn. Legally. He looked at the bylaws. He read the approved species list. His lips moved silently over the Latin names like he was decoding an ancient map. And then he said something John will probably remember for the rest of his life. Buddy, you're not building a hedge. You're building a statement. George was in, completely in, emotionally invested, professionally thrilled, spiritually awakened. He practically vibrated with excitement as he said, I'll get you the biggest Arborvitae this county has ever seen. We're talking giants, privacy monsters, green skyscrapers. And suddenly, the mission had a crew. George didn't show up alone either. He brought Rico and Chico, 2 brothers who communicated entirely through grunts and could lift a tree root ball like it was a grocery bag. Together, they formed a landscaping squad so intense they could probably terraform Mars if someone handed them a shovel. George walked the property like a military general surveying a battlefield. He tapped the soil, inspected the sunlight, calculated the trench length, and then he turned to John and said, We can do this, but it ain't gonna be cheap. Revenge landscaping never is. John didn't care. This wasn't about money. It was about principle. And if principle required hiring the botanical avengers, then so be it. With the plan locked, materials ordered, and George fully committed, John felt something he hadn't felt in months. hope, power, vindication. He could already see Brenda's face the moment she realized her beloved bylaws were about to turn against her. And thanks to George, the man, the myth, the horticultural legend, that moment was inching closer by the day. But if you thought George showing up was wild, wait until fact 6, because Brenda is about to call in reinforcements of her own, including the actual police. If you ever want to know the precise moment an HOA loses its collective mind, here it is. When a homeowner plants legal shrubbery and the HOA responds by dialing 911 like they're reporting a hostage situation. And that's not an exaggeration. Brenda, feeling the pressure of John's rising horticultural empire, decided it was time to unleash the nuclear option, calling in law enforcement to stop a landscaping job. Yes, America, this is where we are now. It all went down on what should have been a quiet, sunny afternoon, perfect weather for ordinary suburban activities like overwatering your lawn or judging your neighbors for their choice of patio cushions. Instead, Maplewood Estates got something straight out of reality TV. George and his crew, the unbothered, unstoppable landscaping A-team, were in full swing. The trench was dug, the giant arborvitae were lined up across the front lawn like soldiers awaiting deployment. Rico and Chico were wrestling root balls the size of small cars. The excavator rumbled across the yard like a dinosaur with a diesel engine. In other words, it was loud, chaotic, and absolutely glorious. And Brenda? Oh, Brenda was not having a good day. From behind her blinds, she watched the unfolding scene like a general surveying an invasion. The hedge was too big, too tall, too thick, too green. It violated her personal sense of aesthetic sightlines, a phrase she uses the way normal people use vitamins, daily and without restraint. To her, this wasn't landscaping. This was insurrection. She stormed outside, clutching her clipboard like it was the Constitution, barking complaints over the roaring excavator. "This machine is disruptive to the neighborhood serenity." She snapped her fingers at John like she was directing traffic. "This is unapproved construction." She pointed at the 9-foot trees. "Those shrubs are massive. They violate the spirit of our guidelines." The spirit, not the rule, the spirit. Brenda had officially gone full HOA philosopher. John, standing there with CC&R receipts thicker than a congressional report, calmly reminded her, "Brenda, that's not a fence, that's a plant. Section 4.1A, approved species, no height limit, all legal, all compliant." Brenda's eye twitched. George, holding a shovel like an Olympic torch, added helpfully, "These bad boys actually help the environment. They absorb sound, they filter air, and best of all, they block ugly things." He looked directly at Brenda's faded floral chair cushions. She nearly combusted. And that's when she did it. She made the call. The call no sane adult should ever make over shrubbery. The call that says, "I've officially run out of power and logic." She called the police. Now, let's be crystal clear. These officers didn't show up because they wanted to. They showed up because a distressed HOA president reported illegal construction, an overhyped structure, and a threat to community standards. In other words, she described it like John was building a missile silo. 2 police cars rolled up, lights flashing, sirens chirping, neighbors emerging from their garages like prairie dogs popping out to witness the show. Kids stopped riding bikes, dogs stopped barking, Even the wind felt like it paused. Officer Miller, a young guy with the face of someone who expected to spend his shift handling traffic tickets, not hedge disputes, approached cautiously. "Sir, we received a call that you're constructing an unauthorized structure exceeding height ordinances." John smiled, not a smug smile, not a rude smile, but the smile of a man who has spent months suffering and finally found his Super Bowl moment. "Officer," he said, opening the CC&R booklet like he was presenting evidence in court, "this is my fence." He pointed at the tiny 2-foot vinyl fence. It's exactly 24 inches tall, well below the 48-inch maximum. The officer nodded slowly. "And that," he continued, gesturing to the towering wall of green behind it, "is not a structure. It is a hedge, a living organism, a plant." He flipped to the marked page. Section 4.1a, approved foliage, no height restriction. The officer blinked at the page, then at the hedge, then back at the page. Behind him, the second officer whispered to Miller, "So it's legal?" Miller shrugged. "Looks like it." George, leaning on a shovel with suspiciously perfect comedic timing, added, "Trees don't break laws, officer. They just grow." Even the officers cracked a smile. Meanwhile, Brenda was behind them, gesturing frantically like she was directing planes on a runway. "It's the size, it's the shade, it's the audacity." But the officers, they were done. "Ma'am," Miller said, "HOA bylaws are civil matters. There's no municipal violation here. We can't enforce shrubbery height." Translation: "Enjoy your hedge, John. Brenda, stop calling 911." It was one of the most satisfying defeats in Maplewood history, a legal victory witnessed by half the neighborhood and 2 police units who now had the wildest story to tell back at the station. But if you think Brenda took that loss gracefully, oh no. Because Fact 7 is where the HOA declares war, with an emergency meeting, a slideshow, and more drama than a reality TV reunion special. If calling the police on perfectly legal shrubbery wasn't dramatic enough, Brenda decided her next move needed to be even bigger, louder, and more unnecessarily theatrical. And what's more dramatic than dialing 911 over gardening? Easy. Calling an emergency HOA meeting like she's summoning the neighborhood Avengers. Within hours of the police politely informing Brenda that they did not enforce shrub laws and that trees can, in fact, just vibe and grow, she retreated into her home like a general regrouping after a lost battle. Shade snapped shut, curtains fluttered, gnomes repositioned ominously. It was clear Brenda was plotting. And plot she did. Before the sun had even set, she sent out an HOA-wide email with the subject line, "Urgent, community crisis, mandatory meeting tonight." A community crisis. You think a sinkhole opened up, or a bear wandered into the neighborhood, or someone painted their shutters a rebellious shade of off-white. But nope, the crisis was John's hedge. The meeting was scheduled at the Maplewood Estates Community Clubhouse, a place that normally smells like stale coffee, lemon air freshener, and repressed joy. But tonight, oh, tonight it was electric. Word had spread fast. Half the neighborhood showed up, not because they cared about sightlines or shade patterns, but because nothing beats live HOA drama. Free entertainment and no streaming subscription required. John arrived early, holding laminated copies of the CC&Rs, each highlighted like a congressional testimony packet. No cookies this time. That was past John, naive John. Now he was prepared for suburban combat. The room filled quickly. Gary the treasurer sat stiffly, clutching a folder like a man afraid he'd be blamed for everything. Carol the secretary knitted aggressively in the corner, always knitting, always judging, yet never speaking. And in the center of it all, standing behind the long folding table like she was about to address the nation, was Brenda. She slammed her little wooden gavel onto the table. Yes, she owned a gavel. The meeting of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association is now in session. If she could have hired a marching band, she would have. With a dramatic inhale, Brenda clicked the remote and fired up a slideshow titled Landscape Anomalies at Unit 2A. The first slide appeared, a low-angle photo of John's hedge looking like a green skyscraper. Next slide, a zoomed-in image of leaves labeled unprecedented density. Next slide, a tree shadow on a lawn captioned significant shading impact. She even had a picture of George's excavator with a caption that read excessive industrial activity in a residential zone. It was the most unhinged PowerPoint presentation ever created. Brenda cleared her throat and began reading her statement in the tone of someone auditioning for dramatic courtroom television. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here tonight to address a blatant and intentional act of hostility against our community's aesthetic integrity. Someone in the back snorted. She continued, pointing at the screen like she was unveiling evidence from a crime scene. This hedge, this structure. John interrupted politely. It's a plant, Brenda. Brenda shot her a death glare. This hedge stands 10 feet tall. 10 feet. It blocks sight lines, casts disruptive shadows, and she paused dramatically. Clearly attempts to circumvent the 48-inch fence regulation. The audience murmured. Some confused, some amused, some desperately trying not to laugh. John raised his hand. Brenda ignored him, the ultimate HOA disrespect. But since the entire room was watching and half of Maplewood was already recording on their phones, like this was a courtroom drama going viral on TikTok, she eventually acknowledged him. You have 3 minutes. John stepped up, placed his laminated copies of CC&Rs on the podium, and spoke with the calm confidence of a man who had been preparing for this speech while brushing his teeth for the last 3 months. Good evening, everyone. My name is John, and unlike what's being implied tonight, I am not a criminal, a vandal, or a rogue landscaper. I'm just a guy who wanted privacy. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. He held up a photo of the tiny white fence. First, the fence. Section 3.2D says fences must not exceed 48 inches. Mine is 24. That is less, significantly less. Brenda twitched. Second, the hedge. Section 4.1A says homeowners may plant approved foliage along the property line. Emerald green arborvitae is clearly and explicitly approved. He flipped to the tabbed page, slowly, dramatically, pettily. And third, the big one. There is no rule, not a single sentence, not a single clause, not even a passive-aggressive footnote that restricts the height of approved plants. Silence. You could hear Gary's knitting needles stop. John continued, so I followed the rules. Exactly. Perfectly. Aggressively. And Brenda, you yourself have said, and I quote, we are a community of laws, not suggestions. Gasps. Someone whispered, bruh. Carol knitted even faster, her hands a blur. In that moment, the room wasn't just siding with John, they were enjoying this. Brenda tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The hedge was legal, the fence was legal, the loophole was real, and the people, they were thrilled someone finally stood up to the HOA monarchy. But this hedge didn't just win the meeting. It sparked a revolution. And in fact, the entire community starts to rise up behind John's legendary loophole victory. When John walked out of that emergency HOA meeting, he expected maybe a couple polite nods, maybe 1 or 2 fist bumps, possibly a neighbor whispering, "Nice job, man." before pretending not to know him in front of Brenda. But what he didn't expect, not even in his wildest hedge-fueled dreams, was a full-blown community awakening. The moment he stepped into the crisp suburban night air, something happened. Something profound. Something historic. The residents of Maplewood Estates, a group typically known for avoiding conflict like it's gluten, began to gather around him. It started with Mr. Patterson, an 82-year-old retired Marine who hadn't said more than 5 words to anyone in 10 years. He limped up, tapped John's arm with his cane, and said, "You did good, kid. Real good." Then he saluted him. Saluted. John still doesn't know what to do with that moment. Next came the Morales family, who had been written up 3 times for decorative flamingo overpopulation. Mrs. Morales whispered conspiratorially, "Brenda hates us too. If you ever need anything, sugar, flour, emotional support, we're here." And then, like suburban dominoes tipping one after another, people emerged from their driveways. People with grudges, people with stories, people with violation letters laminated against their will. Suddenly, John wasn't just a man with the hedge, he was the man with the hedge, the one who cracked the HOA code, the one who stood up to Brenda's botanical tyranny. He had become, in just one night, the suburban equivalent of a folk hero. Someone even shouted, "Long live the hedge!" And yes, a few neighbors repeated it. But what came next was even more shocking. The neighborhood realizes they've been living in fear. As the crowd circled around John, they began sharing stories of their own HOA run-ins. And once they started, they didn't stop. There was the guy who got fined $50 because his trash can was visible for 11 minutes past the approved window. The woman who had been written up for a non-regulation wind chime. It was literally shaped like a sunflower. The teenager who got in trouble for his basketball hoop violated front yard symmetry. And of course, the legendary tale of old Mrs. Kensington, who once received a letter stating her garden hose was too lime green. These people weren't just annoyed, they were traumatized. They'd been living under Brenda's reign like characters in a dystopian novel, but with more hydrangeas. John's hedge wasn't just a plant, it was a symbol of resistance, a symbol of loopholes, a symbol that maybe, just maybe, the HOA wasn't as all-powerful as it pretended to be. Then the first copycat attempt happened. The very next morning, and I mean immediately the next morning, something incredible happened. John looked outside and saw his next-door neighbor, Doug, standing in the yard measuring distances with a tape measure and the level. Doug, known for wearing socks with sandals and grilling at inappropriate hours, looked determined. He shouted across the driveway, "Hey, John, what's that hedge called again? The green thing? The privacy monster?" "Arborvitae," John yelled back. Doug nodded with purpose. "Cool, ordering 30. 30. Not 3, not 5, 30. He was ready to go full hedge militant. Brenda came outside, saw Doug, and nearly dropped her clipboard like it was a live snake. "Douglas," she sputtered, "what are you doing?" Doug didn't miss a beat. Following the rules. Just like my hero, John. Hero. John had a fan club now. But Doug wasn't the only one. By lunchtime, 7 households had placed orders for hedges, vincas, cypress walls, and one guy, no one knows why, ordered bamboo. That one's gonna be a problem later. Maplewood Estates was officially in revolt. The HOA group chat, which Brenda monitored with the intensity of a CIA analyst, exploded. Why is everyone buying trees? Is this a trend? Did John start a movement? Is this an environmental protest? Little did they know it was something better. A loophole revolution. People were suddenly talking about rights, about rules, about not letting Brenda boss them around. Parents were teaching their kids words like bylaws and compliance loopholes. Teenagers were joking about forming a hedge gang. Someone even edited the Maplewood Estates Facebook banner to include a tiny shrub emoji. The HOA was losing control fast. But the best part? Neighbor after neighbor approached John not just with compliments, but with a sense of empowerment. You gave us hope. You showed us the rule book cuts both ways. You reminded us we own our homes. John didn't try to lead a revolution, but his hedge? Yeah, it led one anyway. But with great rebellion comes great retaliation. And in fact 9, Brenda prepares her biggest, boldest, pettiest attack yet, a brand new HOA ordinance written specifically to destroy John's hedge. Just when you thought the neighborhood had seen the worst of HOA wrath, Brenda, fueled by a potent mix of indignation and leftover coffee, unleashed her next weapon, legislation. Yes, a full-on HOA ordinance drafted like she was Congress herself, but with more flair and fewer constitutional constraints. It was the kind of bureaucratic creativity that only exists when someone's personal ego is on the line and they own a clipboard. She called it the Vegetation Compliance and Visual Harmony Act, a title so long it probably needed its own zip code. According to Brenda, the hedge now counted as a vertical structure because, apparently, plants that grew above 4 feet became dangerously rebellious. The HOA rules she carefully composed were full of ambiguous terms like visual obstruction, community aesthetics, and unapproved vertical mass, all meticulously designed to make John sweat. Every word was chosen to trigger anxiety, while sounding reasonable enough that if you challenged it, you'd appear petty. But here's the kicker. John had already anticipated her next move. You see, the loophole he exploited wasn't just in Section 4.1a, it was in the spirit of the law itself. The ordinance might have looked formidable on paper, but it didn't legally override the existing approved foliage clause. This wasn't just smart, it was hedge-level chess. While Brenda was drafting the ordinance in her home office, John was outside sipping iced tea, watching his 10-foot Arborvitae sway majestically in the breeze like living green soldiers, fully compliant and untouchable. The ordinance required homeowners to submit hedge dimensions, spacing plans, and sunlight impact studies for all plantings over 4 feet. Failure to submit this paperwork could result in fines, $100 per day, because obviously Brenda likes even numbers. She also included a section requiring neighbors to post hedge impact notices so passersby could be informed about potentially disruptive greenery. Yes, you read that right. You needed a permit to grow plants and a public notice for everyone who might enjoy their shade. John responded with the kind of calm, calculated audacity only someone who's fought a gnome army and survived could muster. He printed copies of Section 4.1a, highlighted the parts where the HOA rules explicitly gave him unlimited plant height. He even laminated them for dramatic effect. Then, just to really make a point, he emailed every neighbor with a detailed explanation. Attention Maplewood Estates. Any ordinance claiming to limit the height of approved foliage is null and void under the current CC&R agreement. Enjoy your privacy responsibly. It was a masterstroke. Brenda thought she had drafted a legal nuclear bomb. John responded with a precision, tactical smile. The ordinance might have existed on paper, but in reality, it was as effective as a screen door on a submarine. And while she was fuming over her failed legislation, the rest of the neighborhood started seeing the hedge not as a threat, but as a symbol. Suddenly, shrubs became subtle acts of resistance, and John became the figurehead of a botanical revolution. But if Brenda thought she could intimidate him with paper and bureaucracy, she clearly underestimated suburban creativity, because fact number 10 is where John takes his hedge strategy to an entirely new level, and Maplewood Estates will never be the same again. By now, John had gone beyond mere compliance. His hedge wasn't just a backyard barrier. It was a movement, a green fortress, a living monument to clever rule following. Residents weren't just admiring it, they were inspired. Kids measured the hedge for fun. Neighbors asked for advice on planting their own privacy monsters. John's 2-foot fence might have technically been the minimum requirement, but the 10-foot arborvitae behind it was maximum statement. And let's be honest, it looked glorious. With the HOA ordinance failing spectacularly, John decided to go further. He expanded the hedge line, adding more units in strategic locations around his property. Corners became thicker, lines became longer, and the hedge now had a presence that could only be described as intimidatingly lush. Birds nested, squirrels threw clandestine meetings, and the occasional rabbit paused mid-hop to admire the architectural genius of chlorophyll. Every day, John would walk the perimeter, pruning and adjusting, like a general inspecting his troops before battle. Meanwhile, Maplewood Estates transformed. Neighbors who had once been paralyzed by HOA fear began planting their own towering green defenses. The movement spread quietly but effectively. Social media posts celebrated Hedge Day, and suddenly residents were swapping tips about sun exposure, root spread, and spacing patterns like horticultural insiders. The neighborhood that once feared Brenda's wrath now laughed at it. Brenda, for all her efforts, could not stop it. The hedge had grown too fast, both physically and symbolically. It became a living reminder that compliance, creativity, and patience could overcome even the most absurd regulations. And John, he became a suburban legend. He had turned frustration into artistry, fines into motivation, and bureaucracy into a backdrop for botanical triumph. The moral here is twofold. First, know your rules. Second, when the rules are ridiculous, sometimes the best compliance is also the smartest rebellion. John's hedge wasn't just about privacy anymore. It was about empowerment, community solidarity, and showing Maplewood Estates that even the strictest HOA can't smother creativity when it grows taller than 10 feet. So next time your HOA comes knocking, clipboard in hand, remember John and his hedge. Rules are rules. Loopholes are your friends. And sometimes the best way to fight bureaucracy is to plant a tree that blocks their entire view. Stick around, like, comment your favorite part of this saga, and if you're brave, share your own HOA showdown stories. Because Maplewood Estates has taught us all, never underestimate the power of a creatively planted bush.